Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report, or Shabbat Shalom, as our three Jewish viewers may say. I don't know if there's even that many at this point, but welcome, nonetheless. We have quite a bit of news this week, quite a few developing stories, I suppose we could put it, and we're really going to start out with the European news. Now, I feel like we've pulled this straight out of 2017, 2018, or 2019 when it comes to this news about Poland, when it comes to this news about Bulgaria, and when it comes to this news about Italy. It's this regression back to this typical European Union infighting. That being said, I think all those things that happen in those respective countries are very good and very positive developments, but it does feel like a bit of a stagnation that, again, we're treading on, you know, old territory here and that we're not really making. Well, I suppose we are making progress, but it just feels like a repeat of the headlines. Now, starting with that, I suppose Poland has been trading at least verbal blows with the European Union in terms of their policy, and Poland's doing the routine where it's like, well, certainly we need more aid, and certainly you owe us more, and blah blah blah. This is also on top of the border crisis with Belarus, with Lukashenko weaponizing migrants much in the same fashion as someone like Erdogan would, and threatening the European Union, particularly Poland and Lithuania, with the release of these migrants if there isn't further cooperation with Belarus, if there isn't an easing of tensions, if you will. And Poland, in response to this and through a myriad of other issues, has now increased the size of their military, or at least set the target to increase the size of their military to 250,000 active soldiers, active full time soldiers, not part timers, not conscripts, like professional soldiers, 250,000, which would make them the largest military force, at least in, so far as that's concerned, in the European Union. Now, again, of course, countries like France and Germany and the UK, while they are much more military powerful, due mainly to technology, air force, naval power, etc., and would have the ability to raise larger armies if need be. Now, theoretically, at least, who knows how a mass recruitment or even a conscription campaign would go in 2021, or dare I even say 2022, because we're about, what, 2 months out from the new year now? Strange to think. It's been a hell of a more hectic year than whatever 2019 and 2020 were, and I suppose 2022 only has much more rich and fulfilling experiences for us. But with all that being said, you have, like, of course, Poland really taking this opportunity to assert itself, at least with shows of force. Now, there was some recent polling out of, I can't remember the firm that did it, but it was more or less the willingness of people to fight in a war for their country. And out of all the European countries, I think Poland was the highest at like 70 some percent of the population said that they would be willing to contribute to a war effort. And that was, again, a lot of countries had really low numbers. Like Eastern Europe was a bit higher. It was like in the 40s and 50s. Western Europe was like in the 30s. Russia, I think, was at like high 40s, low 50s, something like that. But point being is, Poland pretty much blew all of them out of the water in terms of population's willingness to fight or participate in a war effort, which, I mean, isn't surprising based on the rhetoric we have seen coming out of Poland in the recent years, and some may even say the recent decades, this real desire to really show the world that's something and not just a secondary or tertiary or not even a power at all, and that it has the ability to be a quote unquote independent country and it's enforced its own will. And I suppose that is what leads to the constant butting of heads of the European Union, such as the one we're seeing right now. But I'm particularly more interested in, again, the expansion of the military. And this doesn't seem to be at the behest of anyone in Washington, anyone in Brussels, etc. This seems to be a organic move. Now, for example, if we had the Trump administration still in office with the warm relationship that, of course, Trump had with the quote unquote right wing populists in Poland, I would think, okay, what's going on? How is this going to play into Ukraine, etc. But this seems like I wouldn't. I suppose you call it genuine Polish nationalism, even though it may be guided in a stupid direction by organizations like the EU and NATO, despite their current disputes. But it does seem much more organic than what I would have expected an upscaling of Polish military capabilities to be had you told me about this story a year ago or 2 years ago.
Right. I mean, I think there's several reasons, and a lot of those reasons why they're upscaling their military. Uh, Maybe the easiest reason you could pick off is the idea that America cannot intervene on its side in a successful way should war come. That's possible post Afghanistan, and now with America's almost undivided attention to China. But there are other reasons, and a lot of them revolve around the butting of heads that has been going on all year between uh, Poland's courts and the EU's desire to change those courts. A few months back, we were talking about um, how Poland was structuring their court system and how certain judges were to be reprimanded. They would. I mean, the whole point of this is they feel that there are too many judges from the Soviet era that are still in the system, and they want to get rid of them. They're fanatical about it, right? Um, the EU looks at it differently and thinks that essentially Poland is culturally going to establish a certain amount of independence vis-a-vis its court system, right? And if you accept, as I do, the academics agent's dictum that uh, culture proceeds from political power, not the other way around. So, to be more concise, culture comes from laws, right? So, when Merkel was in power, of course, she hesitated to reprimand Poland, even though Macron and others, van der Leyen is another one, currently head of the EU Parliament. They wanted Poland to be punished, and much to the shock of all the EU member states, but particularly Germany itself and France, but Belgium as well, and the Netherlands. She didn't, and the reason she didn't, I think, is multifold, right? So she understands, I think, better than they do, how pushing Poland right now could push Poland out of the EU. Now, van der Leyen has even said that if Poland leaves, it is an existential threat to the EU. Because, of course, other countries will follow. But I think that Merkel's hesitancy is not just that it will begin an erosion of the EU that already started with the UK, but particularly with Poland, it could be worse. And that's because there is so much German investment in Poland, right? So Poland um, is a bit of a sleeper industrial country. It manufactures many parts that then are assembled in Germany. All right. So there's a lot of, you might call it light industry, but it is industry nonetheless. And Germany relies on this, right? Because the argument between Germany and Great Britain uh, after the after Brexit was, well, Britain buys all these goods from Germany, right? Thing is those goods, many of them are manufactured or partly manufactured in Poland. So I think she was afraid of that. She's also afraid of her reputation. She probably has aspirations to be president of the EU someday. I don't know. She may she may just disappear. She may not do that. It's uncertain, but
Well, then,
definitely,
also just bringing this as an aside, there's the angle about her health, and of course there were
yes,
the welcome ceremony. I think it was of a Finnish delegation where during the official playing of the
yep,
national anthem, she was shaking like a leaf and looked.
yes.
I mean, I'm no doctor, but just knowing people who have had it, Parkinson's is what came to my mind.
Yeah, I remember, and I was just going to get to that. That we don't know. I think you could basically generally underscore legacy. She wants to leave her position as chancellor with a positive legacy, even though she went against the grain in not punishing Poland. Right? Poland has basically said that they're willing to work with the EU on economic matters, but not on social value matters, right? And they even went so far as to ask their judicial tribunal um, to vote. What would they do if there was a discrepancy between EU law and Polish constitutional law? And 12 out of the 14 voted that they would uphold Polish constitutional law. So that's not so Poland is in a fight, and it's in a fight now really for everything with the EU. And for that matter, so is the EU.
And
Whoever wins this will determine history for the next 10, 15, 20 years easily.
yeah, I would say certainly longer than that. I would say certainly several
Yeah.
decades into the future. But you do bring up a good point with how Poland was interested primarily in economic cooperation. When you look at the expansion of these Western institutions such as NATO and, of course, to a much greater extent, the European Union, when they were courting countries like Poland, like Hungary, like the Czech Republic, like Slovakia, the Visegrad countries as they call themselves, and just these Eastern European countries in general, it was of the understanding that, well, this is going to be towards economic development, whether you actually help us develop our economies or whether you just give us free aid money. It was never, and maybe they should have had the foresight to see this, but I suppose liberalism wasn't as mask off, pardon the pun, or pardon the irony, I suppose, as it was today, or as it is today. That these Eastern European countries saw, like, well, certainly, look, we have just gotten over Soviet occupation, communism. We need to restructure ourselves. We need to fit in with the so-called New World Order, as George H.W. Bush would have called it. So they accept this, but not under the pretense that foreign courts or foreign bureaucrats would decide social policy within inside the country. Now, I'm sure they accepted that some degree of economic sovereignty was going to be sacrificed, but I don't think that your average Pole or even Polish politician or Hungarian or whatever foresaw that the European Union would be forcing LGBTQ CIA values or mass amounts of refugee and migrant resettlement onto these countries. And of course, this has been going on since about the mid 2010s. You could argue it started before that, but it became very blatant and it became impossible to ignore as of the mid 2010s, 2014, 2015, with the crisis in Syria, with liberalism going into overdrive on a social sense at least. So again, you have this, bill of goods sold to it, and suddenly they realize, wow, it looks like this deal had a very nasty backdoor to it. And like I said, you could argue maybe they should have saw that coming, whatever. But point being is, you also do bring up a good point with they have also turned these countries into a bulwark because it's not like, especially in Poland, that feelings are warm and tender towards Russia, but it completely robs the possibility when you economically integrate these countries of them becoming Russian assets, Russian satellites, or even aligned with Russia. Now, that's somewhat faltering with, Hungary in particular. And you could also say, when it comes to Merkel and her legacy and Germany choosing not to punish, well, of course, I would say the industrial policy and their economic interdependence, I suppose is what you could call it, was the primary reason. for anyone still interested in EU expansion at all, I mean, what are the two frontiers? It's the Balkan states and it's Ukraine. And I don't know what Merkel's personal agenda on this is, if she would like to see the EU expanded into those countries. But if you start punishing Poland in this way, it is going to be a deterrence for a country like Ukraine or a country like Serbia or
Yeah.
any of these other Balkan states to join the European Union. Well, if they can do that to Poland, Poland is a much wealthier country that has a lot more to throw around in negotiations than we do as Serbia or Macedonia or hell even Ukraine at this point. And we'll get into some of the news about Ukraine and Zelensky making a fool of himself in a moment here. But I suppose going on further, and not that these have incurred penalties from the European Union, but just to show the direction things are going in Europe. You had Bulgaria officially defined gender as biological sex, inextricably linking the two, where more or less, if these laws are carried out to how they're actually supposed to, now we could see, trouble with implementation. I don't know how the Bulgarian quote unquote deep state is, the Bulgarian bureaucracy.
R-
It's effectively abolished
Right, and it's
transgenderism
their
as a
constitutional
concept.
court.
Yes.
And
And
it was no less than their constitutional court that decided this. So it's a big deal.
yes, and again, like I said, if this actually holds, if there isn't something backing it up, backing it down, and I suppose with the Constitutional Court, that is theoretically the highest authority in the land of Bulgaria, as it would be with any country, that it has effectively abolished transgenderism. Now, we'll see if they incur the same sort of wrath that a country like Hungary or Poland does when they make these sort of moves, even though I suppose with just the geographic positioning alone of Poland and Hungary, they are much more likely to be at those centers of dispute. And again, you've had Romania do similar things, of course, nothing to this
Yeah.
extent, and they haven't incurred punishment. For example, I believe they more or less abolished gender studies in the country shortly after Hungary did much the same. But out of Western Europe, and again, you still get these gems out of Western Europe, which it's no surprise comes out of more conservative countries there, such as at least in a social sense, not necessarily politically, out of Italy, where their parliament struck down the passage of what would have been an LGBTQIA anti-discrimination law, pretty much pushing a lot of the so-called protections that they have in Western countries, in the Anglosphere in particular. And not only did they strike this law down, not only did they not approve it, they did so enthusiastically. They were the much of the chamber. I don't have the exact number on the votes, but I don't think it was a close vote by any means.
Yeah,
Much
they
of
were
the
jubilant.
chamber was jubilant when they heard that this law had not passed and would not be going into effect. And it did warm my heart as a diaspora to see my people standing up to this sort of nonsense. But again, it shows that despite how bad things look, and maybe we don't see these things in the English, or maybe you had the right to be blackpilled if you live in say the UK, but it just shows that even with how dark it is, you'll occasionally get these small victories that, in my opinion, can be built upon in countries you thought would have been completely capitulated. And you would think Italy would be a good example. And you can go back, like, I mean, it took Germany until 2017 to get gay marriage, and they had to force that in through an omnibus bill that included things about state security and intelligence agencies, surveillance, economic policy. They pretty much had to put that as a footnote in this, like, massive, like, hundreds of pages long bill to get gay marriage in somewhere like Germany. So while these things, again, while they may have memed populations or propagandized populations, I suppose is a more appropriate term, into supporting these things, at the end of the day, enthusiastic support is very hard to find outside of the Anglosphere, which does make me slightly optimistic about the fate of continental Europe.
Yeah, right. You can almost sense that some of these smaller, more conservative countries, they're kind of smelling blood here. And it is not that I think they want to leave the EU. What they want to a more to an older organization that used to exist when it was more of an economic organization and not an ideological or political one. The problem is um, for Europe to be able to compete with the US and China, having just a bunch of sovereign states within an economic union, and purely an economic union, in the eyes of Brussels and France and Germany, makes that more difficult, right? Plus, there's also the inexorable pull for the centralization of power. These people can that another generation or two, and Europe will be theirs. And this is where the tug of war is happening. Um, but who knows? Putin did say liberalism is obsolete, and he said that last year. I mean, he was probably just trolling the West, uh, because the West is having a lot of internal issues. Anyhow, that's why I think it's interesting that Bulgaria is using their constitutional court to decide these things in a way as a last word, a stamp on their position. Uh, but it's also where the dividing line is, and that is if our constitutional court and if our constitution indeed doesn't matter and can be overwritten by Brussels, then we're a province of Brussels. We are no longer a sovereign nation, right? And so this move by Bulgaria is very interesting.
And
Uh,
I also want to just put
uh,
this in perspective in terms of these ideas being seen as fringe or radical or just far out there. I mean, recall in 2004 that the Republicans, George W. Bush, as part of his re-election campaign, was a genuine momentum to amend the U.S. Constitution to prohibit gay marriage, something that Russia did last year via referendum, and that the entire Western world acted like was this radical act when they had only, again, in the case of Germany, had it legalized for 3 years at that point, and they did so through an omnibus bill. But you have to consider by the time gay marriage was legalized, quote unquote, legalized by the courts in the United States, 60% of the states, about 3/5 of the states, had some sort of restriction against that, whether that was via state legislature, via state courts, or again any of various means of all of that. They had found some way to either restrict or outright forbid it, and that's including so-called civil unions. They were also able to do this too. So it's not unthinkable that a large part of the world, even the so-called like Western, the first world, is still not on board with this. I mean, there's us alone. I mean, and you especially look with how they go overboard, at least with polling numbers, that many people now, not enough to overturn it, and not important enough people to overturn it, are at their wits' end with this sort of quote unquote social progress with the LGBTQIA, with all that garbage. But with all that being said, again, you do have the simultaneous economic and resource, this very raw analytical dispute within the European Union that is almost inextricably tied with this, I guess you could call culture war in the European Union. People always like to talk about one or the other, they like to think about one or the other one. I would say the two are inextricably tied because it goes back to, again, that principle. It's like the country that signed up, the countries that don't want to have their political will overridden by Brussels signed up for an economic union. The countries pushing more unity interpret it as an economic and political union where we have the right to say X, Y, or Z about your course, blah, 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 blah. And with all that being said, again, you really can't divorce the two conflicts, which does really make you wonder how the European Union is going to go moving forward. Because you've seen people like Macron who have been, I guess you could say, visionary about this, where they want a more unified European bloc on the world stage, something that can act as a world power on the same level that a country like the U.S., Russia, or China can, in order to, again, be that other pole on the world stage, if you will, particularly between a U.S. and Chinese world order. But with that being said, with all that happening, again, it's the European Union is going to have to choose a direction. Pretty much, as crude as it sounds, the European Union is either going to have to choose the based unified Europe under Emperor Macron sort of meme, or Europe under the rainbow flag. Now, of course, like I said, those are very crude depictions, those are exaggerations, but they have to decide what kind of Europe they're going to be if they're going to try to pursue this policy of a unified Europe, if that can even work. In which case, I would say it kind of has to work for them, because if it doesn't, it's going to be another century of the continent being under, I guess, what you could call foreign influence, whether that be, again, I know Russians are technically European, but in a geopolitical sense, under a Russian sphere in some parts, under an American sphere, Anglo-American sphere, whatever, or increasingly a Chinese sphere at this point. So it's really, in a case of Europe, it's, stand together or get redacted separately. And so I can understand the plight of the pan-Europeanists insofar as that is concerned, even as somebody on the other side of the Atlantic. But again, that also does bring up the question: well, what's this European bloc actually going to look like? Because I think there is a very reasonable and rational way to go about this that is more than just economic union, that doesn't involve planting the rainbow flag in Warsaw and Budapest. But again, that's not going to happen with the current crop of leaders in the European Union, even with so-called base Macron.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, this is a struggle for a vision of what the EU can be or should be. Um, I think one of the things that a lot of, let's say, garden variety liberals who despise Hungary and Poland, despise, their culture, despise their leaders. Um, One of the things they don't understand is Poland in particular is not the country it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. It is not as reliant on handouts as it used to be. And there may be some politicians within the EU who correctly understand this. I think Merkel was actually one of them. So um, you could even argue that maybe Poland is increasing the army because they um, they might have to leave. It might have to come down to that. It's a possibility. We will see. I guess Poland and Hungary are basic, along with other countries like even Slovenia is looking for um, making some constitutional assertions. Slovakia is another country. So I guess there's a push from the East asking the great EU powers of Western Europe to reconsider and to go a more pragmatic route instead of an ideological one, because the ideological differences will divide them. I I don't know if Western Europe is capable of making that decision.
Oh, of course, because with that, I do think, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, I know we have plenty of Eastern European listeners out there, that Poles, Hungarians, whatever, can tolerate if the West is liberal within their own borders. They can tolerate gay marriage in France or whatever, or whatever socially liberal law in Germany. They don't like it when it's imposed on them. But from the Western European
Yes.
perspective, with this ideology in particular, this is something that must be a shared value with anyone they're going to align themselves with, even on an economic level. Now, of course, exceptions do apply, but when they have the ability to, they will try their damnedest to impose this on people that they can, which is why you see the way they treat Poland and Hungary and these other various Eastern European states within the European Union. So you have one side that is willing to, so-called put aside the differences, and we can get along on issues that we actually agree with, whereas the other side is like, no, you're bad if you don't submit to this. You're in the moral wrong if you don't accept these values. Therefore, you need to accept these values before we can be fully integrated partners. And that's what it really comes down to. So, if there's going to be any budging, it's going to have to be on the part of the West. Now, we have seen these flare-ups, and thus far, I'm only going to consider them flare-ups because of their very short-lasting power of more right-wing, more nationalistic parties in Europe, such as Salvini's Lega in Italy, or Le Pen's National Rally in France, or this new Eric Zemmour candidate who is now polling in second place in France, or, of course, the AFD in Germany. But these more nationalistic, these more Eurosceptic parties, and again, not even anti-European Union parties, Eurosceptics in terms of where they really want a more of a reform of the European Union is the angle a lot of these people come from, who maybe on cultural issues align more so with Eastern Europe, or at least are willing to tolerate the differences. But under the hegemonic liberal control, under the establishment parties of major European countries, that is simply not happening. Because, again, at the end of the day, they will, again, they'll compromise on their principles when they really need to. For example, deals with certain Middle Eastern countries, or buying gas from Russia. By the way, the stream is the stream is powered by Gazprom right there. I figured we do need to tell you guys that. But
Yeah.
with that being said, when they can impose it, when they have the leverage to impose it on those sort of countries, or at least think they have the leverage to impose on those sort of countries, they most certainly will. So, if there's going to be any sort of inter-European cooperation with Europe as a bloc on the world stage, change has to come from the West. Now, maybe that could be spurred on by momentum in the East, but at the end of the day, it's the people in Brussels, it's the people in Paris, it's the people in Berlin who
Right.
have to actually make substantive moves towards accepting Eastern Europe for what it is and not trying to completely turn it on its head socially.
Right. Because they're also running out of time. I think one of the things that is inconceivable as it might seem now, with regards to Poland and Russia, but I think what the EU is worried about is if this continues to take off and Russia starts to gain more influence in these countries, as it has in Hungary, as it continues to have in Serbia. A lot of so-called gains that they've made in the last few years, uh, you know, they'll falter, and even some of the more well-established states will look for that kind of little way that Orban has decided to go. I mean, he's still firmly in the EU, but again, they use their own currency. They don't have any great outstanding debts, so it's very hard to hamper them in. Not all those states that we've been talking about tonight have that ability, but it could come to a point where, I mean, I'm very sure, like, just conceive of Poland wanting, being forced into a Polexit. Who would be their, who will be their allies in this? Well, I mean, it would have to be other Eastern European countries for one, because that would create a vacuum, and even China could act as a mediator, or America could act as a mediator. Even Russia, perhaps a more distant possibility, could act as a kind of a mediator, not in an official capacity. That's not what I'm saying, but in a kind of unofficial capacity that Orban has managed to do with Hungary.
And
So I think the EU is very worried about that. And they're for them, it's the soft power dovetails into the hard power, into hard economics and finance as well. And we've talked about this before too, but the soft power that they're promulgating is a restructured economy. It is based around a decadent, atomized lifestyle, but ultimately that comes down to an economy that's based on what's the word that I'm looking for? Obsolescence. So it's whether it's a device, whether it's a car, um, all of these things can be made much more reliably to last much longer. But economically, it was understood by the 70s that planned obsolescence is the way to go, and that works for. I mean, just the tenets of liberalism are so have so much to do with just the concept of the individual and how only the state can protect the individual, and it's always the individual versus society. So the economy has evolved around these notions, and and this is why the Western Europe does not want to go to an earlier form of the EU.
Oh, certainly. And also to touch on your point about Poland and possible isolation if they are forced out of the European Union by a variety of circumstances. I'm not I'm not saying I see a reconciliation with Russia, but I think it is worth noting and that you do have to remember countries with contentious history with Russia have managed to be much more cooperative than Poland. The two that come to mind are Hungary and Turkey, where both have just as much, if not more, of a contentious history with Russia, with the Soviet Union, even in recent history, than Poland. And for pragmatism's sake, people like Orban, people like Erdogan are able to look past that and pursue a more cooperative relationship, not even out of any sort of Russophilia or admiration or love for Russia, but because they're right there, it's sort of impossible not to deal with them if you want to distance yourself from the West. So I'm not saying I foresee Poland going down that path, but I do think it's much more of a possibility than most people who would just write off saying, no, that would never happen. I do think that circumstances would have to change drastically. There would have to be a number of instances that pushed Poland to that point, but it's not an impossibility.
Right. In other words, in the way that Poland is asking Western Europe to be more pragmatic, this ultimate question beneath the surface is asking Poland to be more pragmatic.
Oh, certainly. And
Right. Because there's been a lot of political gain by being anti Russia in Poland. Right. It's almost like it's a similar fervor that exists in Ukraine as well. It's a social cultural shibboleth. So, in the way trans kids and gay rights are here. Um, so if so, yes, for Poland to be more independent, it would have to start making more pragmatic choices involving its relationship with Russia. Ultimately, not right away. Doesn't have to. It's not even in the next few years necessarily, but eventually it will be there as a question.
yeah, like we said, it needs to take either the Orban or Erdogan approach if Poland wants to maintain some degree of independence. And especially if it could coordinate with somebody like Orban, like Hungary, and with the other surrounding countries in the so-called Visegrad group, just those four countries could be like serve as their literal geographic role as the bridge between East and West. They could literally define themselves as Central Europe as that region dividing East and West, rather than just being again Eastern Europe in denial. And like I said, if Poland gets somebody with the skill and will of Orban in power, now again I don't know too much about the internal Polish politics and who would really be candidate for prime minister or president of the country that would be able to steer it in that direction. But they have great potential to form again that other block that go between East and West if they really want to and if they had people who were skilled enough. So I'm not saying I
Mm-hmm.
foresee that as a possibility, but the potential is there. I will leave it at that. Now,
Yeah.
just covering other brief Eastern European, other European news in general, I should say, is that the two most powerful Catholics in the world had met today, as somebody put on Twitter. Joe Biden and his posse have traveled to the Vatican, of course, to discuss things like COVID and, excuse me, the virus that doesn't have a name that we do not discuss on this show. and the dreaded threat of climate change, which seems to be a very strong concern of the Roman Pontiff, of course, the person who has been the head of the Western Church for the past 2,000 years, has been one of the most powerful people in history and one of the most significant people in the hierarchy of Christianity in general, not just Catholicism. Yeah, the primary concern of somebody who holds an office of that weight is that the Earth's getting a little hotter and people are getting sick. Like, and that's the primary concern of the meeting between the two. Now, again, not to turn this into my personal opinions on Catholicism, but I mean it's just more or less a meeting between two Western liberal leaders. At the end of the day, that's what it really felt like. But there was something conspicuous where a large part of it was denied media access, which I do think is funny. I think it's funny when the media gets pushed out of things because they frankly deserve it and the press gets treated how they deserve to be treated. But I do also have to say it's conspicuous that two darlings of the media, such as Joe Biden and the Pope, denied media access, and it really makes you wonder what they might be discussing behind closed doors.
I yes, and it's we should also mention that it's basically a preamble to the climate change conference in Edinburgh that's supposed to take place very soon in November, which Xi Jinping and Putin will not be attending. Biden had actually even phoned uh, Putin to come, and Putin has declined. Xi Jinping, of course, will not go as well, even though he was at the conference in Dushanbe for basically, Central Asian countries and how they fit within the One Belt One Road initiative. So, I mean, that's an interesting thing. I think Russia and China in this case they're avoiding this because, um, well, it would be considering all the antagonism that both of these countries have faced from America. I mean, if they go, they lose face. It's a weak move. So not going is making a move from a position of strength. They will be demonized for other things later on. So if they're demonized for not showing up in Scotland for this climate change conference, which is part of the whole reset thing, well, so what? We've got, we have our own economic union and our own things that we have to accomplish. So it's really not a big deal. Much better to stay home. So I think the meeting with the Pope is a preamble to that. We saw this sort of thing happening in June, basically on the eve of Putin and Biden meeting in Vienna. And I think that the Pope is there to convince, let's say, Catholics and conservatives in Europe that, even the Pope agrees with this, right? Like, Biden can't be all that bad. And, climate change is very dangerous, and we can definitely do something about it immediately, or within the next 10 years. We can really save this planet. So that's what I think his basic function is. He's there to legitimize politicians like Biden, and political and ideological as well.
Oh, certainly, and I think that you have it nailed down, especially in the role, just of the speaking politically at least, the role of the papacy since I would say the end of World War One has more or less been that, and especially from World War Two and the Cold War onward has been again, and that's not speaking to individual popes. I'm not the most well-read person on Catholic Church history, especially in the modern era. I'll fully admit, but again, and you could say it's a much more honorable cause depending on your point of view. That when Pope John Paul went to Poland and really incited Eastern Europeans against Soviet occupation. Again, it's been this something that's been expected, I would say, of popes since at least the end of World War II, that they would be sort of this funnel for more conservative and reactionary elements of Europe, of the Western world, in order to at least make an alliance of convenience with liberalism. Now, I would say nowadays it's much more blatant with, again, things
Mhm.
like the climate summit, and of course, I think that's the next phase of why they're going to quote unquote lock us down. But that's speculation aside. But I do think you brought up a good point with Xi Jinping meeting with Central Asian leaders. Just the contrast between the two poles of the world, where you have what is more or less a liberal sewing circle that's going to be happening in Scotland shortly here, where they all talk about how if we just tax something like carbon, we can reverse supposedly decades upon decades of industrial pollution damage and save the world by 2030, versus China meeting with Central Asian leaders saying, well, this is how we're going to build the Silk Road of the 21st century. Now, you can contest Chinese claims, you can not like China, whatever, but you have to admit, and I've been forced to admit as well, that one side has a tangible vision for the future, whereas the other side is, to put it in polite terms, more or less just mutually pleasuring themselves. And pretty. And I mean, fundamentally, that's what it is. Patting each other on the backs, and here's a term for it. It's an orgy of liberalism. That's really the only way I can put these sort of, especially these climate change summits. Now, there's other summits. I would say the UN General Assembly fits that bill more or less, but it is an orgy of liberalism. It's where they all come together. They lay aside all practical concerns. It's all about pleasuring themselves to this greater ideology that half of them really don't even believe in. It's just a funnel for money, and the other half are naive enough to actually buy into it. And of course, then you have the occasional Biden who is just too old to know what's going on. But I mean, with that all being said, uh, an interesting development out of all this. Now, despite that, Putin nor Xi Jinping will not be showing up. Russia and China did, on paper, agree to climate change goals, except they pushed 2030 to 2060 and have no real intention about doing anything about it, which you could say is capitulation. You could say is saving face, and just trying to be a quote unquote team player on the world stage, however you want to put it. But fundamentally, you probably aren't going to get much change considering the fact, okay, you just had Nord Stream 2 completed, and you just had Russia cut a deal with Moldova when it comes to a more oil and gas. They struck that deal within the past couple days here. So there's no tangible change there. And one could argue, in a way, of course, you could reference the Great Reset, which in a way I think is very optimistic. Now, I do think that they're trying to radically restructure things in order to preserve the power. I think a large part of the virus lockdowns and the response to the virus was a shoring up of a fragile liberalism, which they did to some degree succeed, I will admit. And I do think climate change will be the next piece of the puzzle when it comes to that. But maybe they're just too stupid. Maybe they think that they're playing the long game, that they've outsmarted Russia. But ultimately, you look at the two, and you have Europe and the Western world taking an out of sight, out of mind approach where, oh, if we cut carbon emissions, if we cut blah, 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 by whatever, we cut our own energy production, it's no problem. Look, we're doing our part. But we're going to import all this energy from abroad, though, import all this oil and gas from abroad, and still burn it, because apparently it burns cleaner when you import it from abroad. I don't know how that works, but again, that's assuming you even believe in the climate change narrative, which I'm very skeptical about. Let's just put it that way. In fact, you know what? I'm actually going to take the controversial position. I do believe what they're saying about climate change, but honestly, I think it's a good thing. I think it's funny, and I think it actually has more benefits than drawbacks. I think they've been lying to us this whole time. I want to cultivate corn in Siberia. That's all I'm going to say, okay? I want to live to Khrushchev's dream. I think he really had something going, and you know what? Frankly, I think we look think what you about Khrushchev, but I think we owe him that. And fundamentally, I just want to cultivate crops in the Arctic. That's all I'm saying. But okay, I'm getting off on a tangent here. But point being is, I think I actually have those maps on file here when it comes to crop cultivation predictions. Let's see, I'll have to pull those up, but it's projections by 2050 if you believe in the official climate change narrative. Now, I have the source available for Europe here. That pretty much just shows a general trend. Okay, here it is. We have that, and I can of course enlarge this for you. So, and I'll pull up the key for this map as well. Yeah, great show prep. I know. Please don't say anything. Okay, I try my hardest. But let's see. Okay, here's the agricultural key. And this may be a bit difficult to read. These are screenshots from a presentation I watched on YouTube. I think it was a Zahan, which he's hit or miss, but I suppose that is. But what you have right here in these hexagonal shapes, for those of you who are looking at the screen right now, green represents a gain greater than 5% in potential average yields for crops such as corn, potato, rice, and wheat by 2015. You look at the areas in green, it's most of Northern Europe, a lot of Russia. It seems like the only areas that really suffer are central Italy and southern Spain and like central France. Like even some parts like you can see like in the
Hmm.
Mediterranean, like southern Italy, like even in Sicily, in Sardinia and Corsica, you can see down there on that map, and even like in southern Greece and Turkey, like they all are projected to have large crop yields. And then the more tannish yellowish color you have is 0 to 5% gain or loss, so not much change. But then the orange color you have is where you have a loss greater than 5%. But you look at the map, it's mostly green. And this is Europe in particular. Funny enough, actually, the UK is entirely in green as well. So you look at who has the stand to benefit from the so called alarmism about climate change, it's countries like Germany, it's countries like Russia, and I do believe I actually have a map that shows Asia. I think the projections are less friendly for China, but again, that's assuming that all these narratives are true right here. So I can go ahead and take a look at
This
that
is
right there.
amazing. Yeah.
Um, oh, it looks like we did lose signal there for a minute, but again, just while I'm busy pulling up these maps right here, so let's just do East Asia right now, and yeah, but I think I'm belaboring the point, but I think it's worth showing. Now, it's actually not a pretty forecast for most of China, Southeast Asia, and India. Though, like they're in the yellow, they're going to suffer. Um, Again, and you can see even like in the Asian part of Russia, even like northern Japan is going to have increase from this. But again, I've belabored the point. I think this is worthy of a whole entire separate episode on the effects of so-called climate change on crop cultivation. But I've been going on for a while there. But point being is, at the end of the day, no matter how true it is, it's utopian to think that human efforts can change it, especially by 2030. And these summits are, again, liberal orgies, to put it in a polite sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we've had these warnings, that stretch back 10 years. And 10 years ago, we only have 10 years. So 2001 was already too late. And so if we don't do anything by 2030, it'll all be too late. It's a carrot. It's a carrot. There's a bit more of a stick now, but you can see that the ruling class, there's a political will. They're aligned, and they are going to go along with this, whatever the real reasons may be. With Trump out of office, you can see now they are eager to get to this next stage, and you know uh, the the COOF and all its ramifications have been really a blessing, if you will, right? People, in a sense, have been traumatized, and they're more likely to either withdraw or look at this with far more hopeful eyes than they would have otherwise. So there's maybe because hope itself is at a premium. Those who still, hope in our elites, uh, basically are putting in more eggs into it, to use all kinds of mixed up metaphors. But um, that's how I see things developing now. If Trump was in office, it would have been very, very different. There would have been disagreements on this. That would have been bad for the EU in terms of projecting the sense of unity with respect to America. For the Western world, if you will. Um, And the other thing, ironically, if he got elected, is you probably would have still had uh, Democrats who would have been hesitant about taking the vax, right? Because we saw Cuomo, Pelosi, uh, AOC. I mean, there was a host of Schumer. There's tons of them that were all scared and telling you to be scared to take the vaccine. Well, just imagine if he had been reelected, right? Like, then they would have found themselves in a spot very similar to his own supporters who don't want to take the vaccine, regardless of whether he took it or not. Um, but in any case, I'm going off topic. The thing is, they are the political will is there. All kinds of factors are aligned now, and they're going to push forward. I mean, we saw the Congress basically interrogating the oil companies. Not that I'm sympathetic to the oil companies, but I'm
Unless
saying,
they're Gazprom.
unless they're Gazprom, then it's different. But I'm just saying they're kind of like a show trial, like it's theatrics, right? It's part of the unity which is developed around this issue, and that they're finally, after years of delay, going to go forward. That's all I'm saying. Like, this is just, it's just window dressing, them interrogating, the oil companies and demonizing them.
Oh, certainly. And
Like I say, I'm not a friend of oil companies. That's not that's not my point. I'm trying to find a much more subtle point to make here.
yeah, it's like they're you. It's not like, again, we're not fans of oil companies, barring of course the aforementioned Gazprom. But it's really just a passing of the blame on people who really, like, again, they could move mountains and it still wouldn't make a difference. The point being is there's people who are far more worthy of blame than they are, despite the fact that they're not necessarily on our side or so-called good guys. And another thing I'll bring up, you touched on this point, it is amazing how much of a stumbling block Trump was just by being Trump, not even any substantial policy, just the air of division that he created, which may be the one thing, the sole thing that could convince me to support him in a 2024 run. Not that I'm saying I would, but the other thing is there. Another angle I will briefly touch on. You do also have to consider, and I think listeners of our show won't find this a surprise. Predictions have been rather pessimistic on our end, and I think that the people in power also have those same pessimistic predictions, and it could be that they're trying to lull people into accepting a lower standard of living, accepting these sort of constraints on their life that would have been inevitable because of the drying up of economic prosperity, but they can feel good about it because they're saving the planet and fighting climate change. Now, that is, I don't think that's entirely the explanation, but I think that is one reason that they've stuck so firm to this as a civic religion overall this time, the fact that it can be used to excuse any economic shortcomings or failures we might have because we're doing this to save the earth and not because we genuinely mismanaged the largest economy in the world. But that's aside the point, and I do have a unless you have any more, I suppose we could move on to Middle Eastern news.
Yeah, we could. I just two very brief things. Uh, Basically, the oil companies have to receive the blame because most of the time it's your average Joe American that's being blamed for climate change, right? So they have to pay their dues as part of this process. And the bottom line is, like, you have to get people to find um, a big reason why they should have lowered expectations for themselves and for their children and just for their future in general, because you're going to have less, and you're probably not going to be happy, but at least you'll save the planet in the meantime. So that's part of the reason for this in the first place. The other thing I was going to say is we should probably touch just a little bit on Ukraine before we move to the Middle East.
Oh, certainly. I saw you had some news on that, so I'll let you take over from here.
Yeah, so Ukraine this week used one of their reconnaissance slash attack drones from Turkey. I think it's like a Buryat. I'm probably butchering the name. A cannon apparently belonging to the the LNR, the DPR of the Donetsk People's Republic, was taken out. Now it's important to remember that this cannon was not placed in a dugout to help conceal it, nor was it camouflaged. Usually that is what happens, although I've seen them use cannons without camouflage or dug in. But, that was when the war was far hotter, about 7 years ago. So, yeah, um, make of that what you will. In any case, the cannon was damaged. There were no casualties, but this gave the impetus for the Ukrainians to seize one of these towns not far from where this had happened. The name escapes me, the town's name, that is, starts with an M. It literally just slipped my mind right now.
Is it
But
Mariupol? I know there was heavy fighting there, like 2015. That's like where Azov gained their infamy. Was Mariupol? I think it was, or was it
no, no, no,
further
no, no, no.
east?
This is not that far south. No.
I was about to say,
Um,
like, I'd be surprised if they got to that, and like, I don't know how I missed the story. So you caught me a little off guard with that. But if it's some, just small village in the east, then do continue.
yeah, this is a small place. It was basically in the no man's land, in the no contact zone, that both sides had previously agreed they would not occupy. Uh, in any case, Ukrainian forces took over, but they suffered two casualties as a result. So the video I saw was a frustrated troop who is saying, "Where's the help? We've lost two of our comrades, and we're going to have to vacate this place. You show offs, you just left us stranded." So um, the other news I've seen is there's a buildup of tanks uh, from the Russians along the borders that has just begun. Now, is it going to be something that we saw take place in April? I don't know. I think you cannot write off a hot war happening there again. However, I would say that um, Zelensky's ideas are basically to wear the Russians down, to occupy them with eastern Ukraine, to make that a bigger priority instead of like a full-on invasion, right? A full-on invasion, I think, is something he can't do, and it doesn't have like he doesn't have enough of these drones to really sway the battle. You can see that even though they take over a no man a town in the no man's land is something they can hardly secure. Um, Granted, the Ukrainian army is probably in better shape than it was 7 years ago, but I don't think they're really willing to go all out. I don't think that's the plan because I don't think Zelensky wants to live the fallout of a defeat in that scenario. So it's more about poking, and making Russia look weak. In doing so, but without him losing face. Because if he loses face, it's over. This is still, for most Ukrainians, a vastly unpopular war, and the morale to fight it does not exist with most of the conscripts. It is there only with certain very ideologically motivated groups.
Oh, certainly. And you even had people who are in the military outright calling out Zelensky as a failure and said that you haven't given us proper leadership or proper resources to fight this war, and that you let two of our, again, as you're saying, two of our comrades are now dead. And I suppose it fits the trend of the only Ukrainian president ever to get reelected was uh, Yanukovych. I almost called him
There
Poroshenko
you
again.
go.
That's how. Yeah, and he was driven from power in the Maidan. Now, moving on from that brief Ukrainian news, we have some Middle Eastern news. I'll start with the smaller stuff first. So, starting with Afghanistan, ISIS K and Al Qaeda will be ready to carry out attacks on the U.S., said Pentagon officials. And they said within 6 months. Now,
Oh, yeah.
they still haven't told
Wow, they're
us
letting us know.
what the K stands for in ISIS K. I have my speculations, but I
Uh,
digress. um, Yes, I was hoping when I saw that headline that finally they'd tell us what the K stands for now. Like I said, I have my speculations. I don't think I'm allowed to say them on YouTube, but I think I'll leave that to your imagination. Now, of course, one could say that, oh, well, they're gearing up for another attack of Afghanistan, or they're gearing up for I don't think that's the case. No, I'm not saying those are invalid concerns with the way the American empire has operated in the past, but I do think it is what one would call alarmist. And with what I could say about that is, I would say it's more of a backdoor back into Afghanistan, not necessarily boots on the ground thing, or into Central Asia in general. But what we discussed with our Afghanistan withdrawal episodes, more or less a blank check to conduct airstrikes and drone strikes and missile strikes on targets in Afghanistan. Sort of like
Right.
Syria, but without the air defenses, so to speak. It's this green light to go ahead and strike targets in Afghanistan whenever they feel like, whenever they want to influence the situation there. Again, I don't foresee another invasion of Afghanistan or even more boots on the ground beyond what we may or may not already have there. But it's more or less just saying, well, yeah, we reserve the right to fire missile strikes into Afghanistan whenever we damn well please, is pretty much what the Pentagon is saying, which is more or less what they said in the peace agreement under Trump, what they said during the withdrawal, and I suppose they're just reinforcing this by creating the boogeyman now.
Yeah, I mean, if it's not that, it's basically like they're prompting you for some kind of a gay op in within the next 6 months. I mean, that's the way I see it. It's why? I mean, does anybody really trust the Pentagon anymore? Like, especially when it comes to this sort of news.
Well, on contrast with that, you see the Taliban warming up to international relations. Of course, China was the first big one that they really broke diplomatic ground with. Then, as we covered last week, they met with Russian officials. And now, of course, Pakistan is opening up to Afghanistan once again. But it does look like that the European Union also wants to begin bringing some diplomats into the country for the purposes of humanitarian aid. And so far, just the list of countries we have right here. We have the European Union wanting to open a mission in Kabul, along with Qatar, Turkey, and Pakistan, and Russia and China, of course. So it puts the United States in an awkward position where even its so-called allies have gone behind its back on the Afghanistan issue and establishing at least some sort of temporary diplomatic mission there, which I suppose isn't a surprise. And the figure that at least the South Front article cites, that 19 million Afghans, which is about 45% of the population, currently experience high levels of food insecurity. So I suppose, at least as far as the European part is concerned, I think, again, as we got into this, the possibility of a refugee crisis, that they want to stabilize the situation on the ground in Afghanistan to the point where people aren't starving, so they don't create another migrant crisis for the West, because the precarious state of the West end could probably not tolerate another migrant crisis. That would be my guess. Of course, Turkey, Qatar, etc., are trying to gain their influence as well with Russia and China. I'm sure the European Union also has their motives to gain influence within Afghanistan, but I would assume that Europe's main concern in Afghanistan is just stabilizing the situation to the point where they don't come to Europe and they don't flood across the Greek-Turkish border. At least that's what I would assume. It doesn't seem like that. I doubt Macron or Merkel or the bureaucrats in Brussels just sitting around plotting, thinking, how do we put Afghanistan firmly in our sphere of influence, firmly under our control? How do we wrestle away from Russia, China, and the Taliban? I doubt that those are the sort of conversations happening in Europe right now. But again, there of course probably is vying for influence, whatever. But I don't see that. I don't see it as some great imperial ambition on the part of Europe. But that is contrasted with American statements about ISIS-K and Al Qaeda, which more or less leads me to believe that there probably will just be some offhand strikes on Afghanistan, or at least we're reserving the right to whenever we feel the need to. And I suppose, despite everything, this is a somewhat positive outcome out of all the uncertainties and all the things that could have gone wrong with Afghanistan, because I think both us and a lot of other people just across the political spectrum had much more pessimistic forecasts for Afghanistan. I know it's still early on, the withdrawal was only like 2.5 months ago at this point, but I have to say, it looks like the world has more or less just accepted that the Taliban or some equivalent organizations here to stay, that Afghanistan will be ruled by tribal Muslims for the foreseeable future, and that there's not anything we can do about it, and even if there was, it's not worth the resources as demonstrated by a 20-year American war and a 10-year Soviet war.
Yeah, I think the Europeans wanted, particularly Britain, wanted America to stay there. They're probably afraid of, like you say, ramifications that an Afghanistan that's integrated into a Chinese and Central Asian economy would not benefit them, and so they're looking long term. Also, I think um, strategically, again, Britain is sort of playing both sides here. They wanted America to stay in Afghanistan, and at the same time, they want to help America provoke China over Taiwan, whereas France, for instance, and the other European powers do not want that. They want a middle road. They see war with China, or a China that's, let's say, economically compromised or devastated, would put them in a bad position. We've discussed this before about how one of every three cars that are manufactured in Germany end up in China. And so there's all kinds of economic reasons and incentives why um, the European idea of how to contain and maintain China as, let's say, an economic partner, as a customer, uh, and the kind of maintain and contain strategy that the Americans are employing are, they're different. They do not align, except for some, you know basic basically markets. But China is going off in a different direction. They've reached a phase where, their prosperity phase has been largely accomplished. This is something that they've been working towards since, eagerly, since the late 90s, and now they want a kind of a distributist approach to their economy, where they can ensure other, less wealthy Chinese receive some of this prosperity. So China is really clamping down now on the corporations, making sure that they are in line with Beijing and that they know where the plan is going, right? They've been having these historic, like, how can I put it? China has had these, like, historic meetings. Like, they had one in 1981 after Mao, to look at the revolution since the 40s, and then they had, I believe, well, they just had one now this year. And so they're basically planning the next 40 years, the rough draft for it. And it will be to disperse the wealth that has been generated. And also, Beijing, of course, they're very careful that some of these corporations have CEOs that have, they have a kind of celebrity status in China, right? And China does not want capitalism to take over. They do not want to create a cult of oligarchs. That that Ayn Rand notion of economy. No, no, no. So they're not going to go that route. This is a very old civilization. It's been around a very long time. It's going to be around a long time, and so they're not going to, you know, uh, have this class of, industry oligarchs basically taking over the show. Uh, and this is, of course, this is a high low versus the middle, but the middle here is the very upper high middle that we're talking about in terms of power strategies, right? Um, by Beijing doing this, it will gain the favor of poor Chinese. So it's effectively done that. It will cement their support. The party will cement its support, and the the let's say the merchant, the banking, and the industrial sector will not be able to usurp or to pull ahead of the party and become, let's say, the ruling elites of China in the way that they've done in the West.
Now, yes, I do agree with that assessment completely, and I think that's a very good and take on China that really summarizes everything you need to know about that situation in particular. And I did have more news about China in that regard that the president of Taiwan has admitted that U.S. trainers have been present in the country for the past year. Now, I think everyone knew this. I think everyone at least suspected that, of course, there is a heavy American presence in Taiwan. No surprise. And she was even saying things. Her name is Tsai, Tsai. And forgive my poor Chinese if we have any Chinese viewers, which I'm sure we at least have one out there in the audience. Maybe you can correct me. Maybe you want to come on the show. Maybe you want to give us a insight on what life is in China. Just get in touch with us. But that's aside the point. Has admitted that Joe Biden has given more to Taiwan than previous American presidents. Now that I suppose that was mainly in reference to Trump, who, of course, you'll recall that Trump committed a major transgression upon his election. That one of his first calls to foreign leaders, as even just president elect, was to the Taiwanese and pretty much wanting to guarantee security to them. And of course, there was the situation with Hong Kong. Saw a closer bond, closer ties that bind, if you will, between the U.S. and Taiwan, the Western world and Taiwan in that regard. And it looks like that Joe Biden, many people who many people expected he would be a much more pro mainland China, pro CCP China, just based on his previous track record, seems to have been, at least according to the Taiwanese, one of their biggest supporters in decades. Now, that isn't a surprise. The U.S. and China tend to drift further and further every day, every month, every year at this rate, and the point where it's becoming a genuine rivalry. Now, of course, we are still very economically interdependent. That hasn't changed. Now, Trump's trade war did cause a major rift in that. It did start the process of a divorce of Chimerica, if you will, but it still is in more or less full force. The process of divorcing the two has only just begun. And it isn't a surprise that this is happening, and it does make you wonder what the goal of it is, because it's the first official acknowledgement of a U.S. presence in Taiwan, and the last American presence was there in 1979 as the process was underway to switch recognition from the Republic of China to the People's Republic of China under the Nixon and subsequent Ford and Carter administrations, where we again made that, some may call it, deal with the devil with China during the Cold War in order to get an upper hand over the Soviet Union. And it looks like, I'm not saying we're going to revoke recognition of mainland China or the People's Republic in favor of Taiwan, but it does seem like we're reverting to a much more pro Taiwan policy. Will we recognize them as an official state, or will it remain this unofficial relationship? That does remain to be seen, but it does show at least some confidence on the part of the Taiwanese that they're going to outright come out and say this. Now, they haven't been reprimanded by the U.S., they haven't issued any retraction, so I imagine they did so with the green light from Washington when it came to making these statements. Perhaps it's to intimidate China, put pressure on China. I think that all remains to be seen, but it certainly is at least a rhetorical escalation that we haven't seen in quite some time between America and China.
Well, I mean, you could say that this ambiguity plays into America's hand. Um, I guess we're talking about the town hall meeting with Biden earlier this week, where he let slip that indeed they are willing to go to war with China over Taiwan. He said it was protection, but it would mean war. Um, and then his White House had to retract that quite quickly, and so now you have Taiwan's prime minister basically implying the same thing that Biden had said. So this creates a kind of ambiguity. What's really going on? Um, that serves America's interest in that maybe it keeps the population, well, maybe suspenseful, but also gives them hope that there won't be war over this because the war drums in the media have been beating very steadily the last 2 years, particularly this year. And it's I think it's also there the greater point it's is there to confuse China, this ambiguity. I don't think China is, to be honest, very worried. I think China is very confident that they're going to get this territory back, and it may take a short time, it may take a long time, but they fundamentally believe that time is on their side. But it's also interesting to note, when you were bringing up about how everybody's expectations of Joe Biden were that he was soft on China. He's in with the Chinese, right? It's another stupid game that American conservatives always play. For them, everything is about who can out patriot and be out loyal the other guy, about who's more American, right? It's a real identity crisis. And if, like, I never once thought that, I never once believed in the idea of China Joe, right? Like, he is, I mean, he's not. He's working within certain constraints that Trump had to work within. And as you say, he has given even more arms to Taiwan than Trump did. And indeed, Joe Biden has made a bigger effort and a more successful effort in making Taiwan feel secure than Trump ever did. So it's one of these dumb things um, because you notice the left always avoids, like, when they see the right in America do something so stupid, half the time they don't even acknowledge it, which is smart, really. So, anyways, that's beside the point, but a point nonetheless.
Certainly, and again, what I was getting at with that, again, at that point where a lot of the American elite may
Hello.
have been in bed with China when it came to the relationship of Chimerica, as I was describing earlier, Biden was historically on that side, but seeing the drastic changes in U.S. Chinese relations between about, say, 2014 to present day, the idea that there would try to be this reconciliation of Chimerica may have been on the table, but I don't think was any serious consideration by the people who were assuming power. I think it was more or less accepted that China will have to be treated at least as an adversary moving forward, if not an outright enemy. And I think that, of course, we're seeing that play out now with Taiwan. Now, that's all I had for that, and I just have a couple pieces of Middle Eastern news to finish off, starting with there has been something of a rapprochement, as the French would say. Forgive the terrible pronunciation to any potential French viewers we may have, between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, of course, their official diplomatic relations were actually intact until 2016, and they were suspended after pro government groups in Tehran stormed the Saudi embassy. And That was the real downfall of that. Of course, they had been on the opposing sides of various conflicts from Yemen, Syria, etc., fighting over influence in Lebanon. But it does look like that Saudi Arabia is beginning to come to the bargaining table with Iran, and this is actually somewhat thanks to American influence because Biden has tried to pursue the course of repairing the JCPOA to some degree. He put arms sanctions on Saudi Arabia and suspended arms trade with Saudi Arabia. And the U.S. actually took the Houthis in Yemen off their terrorist watch list. They're no longer considered a terrorist organization by the United States government. So that was also a very big move. Again, that was likely part of the negotiations with Iran trying to salvage something of the JCPOA, which was torn up by Trump in 2018. And with that playing out,
Mm.
you've seen, again, Saudi Arabia also ease up on Qatar with those relations. You've also seen Saudi Arabia make overtures to Turkey, trying to improve relations there. So it does look like, and of course, due to the oil and gas boom in the United States in 2014, Saudi Arabia's budgets have never really recovered since. Now we'll see what the higher oil and energy prices in general do for Saudi Arabia over this past year, but it does look like between their economic and geopolitical situation, they have been back to a corner and are now willing to start talks. And again, we saw this as a slow process. First, it was Qatar and Turkey. Then it was an acceptance of Assad Syria. And now it looks like, and again, we saw murmurs of this before, but it looks like they've taken the full step of trying to actually mend relations with Iran. After, again, a several years, if not decades long, Cold War between the two in the Middle East.
Yeah, I mean, this actually surprised me, but it is a kind of a testament to how much of America's resources are being stretched right now. Uh, and it doesn't really know. I mean, on the face of it, I don't want to say it doesn't know where to prioritize, but there are an awful lot of fires that have to be put out and all kinds of management that has to be done. And there, it may be too many. It may be too overwhelming. Um, Time will tell. Just to bring it back to the Houthis have taken over one of the suburbs of Marib. This is a very, very contentious and hard-fought battle. In the last weeks, both sides have claimed hundreds of losses. I mean, it might be 100 on each side. I'm skeptical of, they're often exaggerated. They're I mean, it's part of fourth century warfare. What you want to do is completely blow the doors off the other guy, the baddies that you're fighting, and diminish their morale. Um, this is something that's been, especially part of modern warfare, stretching even back to Wellington versus Napoleon. Um, the British already understood journals, and they already understood how to create misleading guidelines, whereas the French still looked at the printed word mostly as a journal and didn't take advantage of it as well. But in any case, I'm going off on another tangent. Yeah, so uh, things are heating up in Yemen. In a sense, Iran is applying pressure in two different areas, both in Yemen and in Syria, when we're talking tactically, and then abstractly we're talking about the possibility of Iran maybe one day having you know nuclear missiles. Now they say they're not interested, but I think they're interested in America not knowing definitively one way or the other.
Oh, yes, the Israeli approach. We may have them, we may not have them, who knows? But it is interesting that you do bring up nuclear weapons and uh, enrichment of uranium because also another factor to consider is how much role China may have played in this because China has been making overtures to both. Of course, Iran, very blatantly, very obviously, they have been getting oil and energy from Iran. But they've also been in talks with Saudi Arabia and investing in Saudi Arabia and actually helping them enrich uranium. Now, of course, it's officially for energy. The speculation for years is, will Saudi Arabia start their own nuclear program in response to the Iranian nuclear program? But as the American order does wane, I suppose you could, at least in part, and I suppose time will tell, chalk this up to China playing a greater role in mediating conflicts between smaller and less powerful countries. And again, it's not that China officially mediated this, but I'm sure both of them having increasing relations both economically and geopolitically with China certainly helped the process along. Maybe there were some backdoor deals, backdoor
Yeah.
negotiations, but I mean, if again Chinese diplomats can take credit for this reconciliation, I'm sure they would be at this point. But maybe that will be further down the line when it comes to this. And it does look like Saudi Arabia in general is more desperate because they were one of the slew of Middle Eastern Muslim countries that made overtures to Israel under Trump and Kushner's peace plan, quote unquote peace plan for the Middle East. So I if I had to just put a sentence to it, I think Saudi Arabia at this point, with a retracting American empire, does feel more and more desperate and feels like instead of funding terrorism across the region, across the world, it may be time to engage in some good old fashioned diplomacy with our neighbors. Not that I think that they will cease funding to these groups now. They have backed off of both of Yemen and Syria so far, not out of any genuine desire, but more so out of realistic political implications. And just another brief piece of news I'll touch in on the Middle East before we get into Syria, because there's a little bit we have to cover with Syria, so especially with Turkey's operations in Syria. It does look like in Egypt, Sisi has ended the state of emergency, and many are speculating because a consolidation of power, of course, over the past few years and over the past year has taken place where he can comfortably end the state of emergency. Now that was declared due to terrorist attacks, particularly the ones on I think it was those two churches in on the Sinai Peninsula that were attacked in 2018 or 2019 was the reason for the most recent state of emergency, and those have drawn down. Now, of course, this is an Egypt that is becoming more involved in matters with Libya, as well as, of course, making overtures to Syria. And we've discussed this in one of our Libya episodes. I think it was close to the beginning of the year, maybe even been last year at this point, where Egypt is eager to play a greater role in the region, eager to be a regional power again on the level of like an Iran or Saudi Arabia or Turkey. And particularly, they've really gained their fame or infamy with that by being one of Turkey's principal rivals on the issue of Libya.
Yeah. This is a country that just 4 years ago was facing all kinds of sectarian violence. Now they still have a problem with ISIS in the Sinai. Remember, ISIS claims they knocked down a Russian jet carrying Russian holiday goers. And then there was that civilian tourist bus that was attacked, and like people were literally ripped to shreds with gunfire, and it was set ablaze, if I remember correctly. Um, so it does seem to be stabilizing, and it's also, I guess, importantly, is Egypt is one of those countries that has come out and recognized um, Syria, and they are anxious for a certain amount of normalcy returning to the Middle East, and the way to do that is to accept that Assad essentially has won, and that it's better for everybody that they cooperate in a more meaningful way. Qatar has reached out, of course, so has Jordan. So I think slowly the tide is turning.
Indeed, and now moving on to Syria proper, just to close out the show, we do have some news out of there. I'll start briefly with just a quick update here. We'll show our map for Syria, which, let's see here, that is the 1016 map, and the map updated for 1029, which is the day we were recording this, just so all of you know. You'll be seeing this on October 30th, hopefully. We have quite a bit of activity in northern Syria in general, particularly northwestern Syria. Quite a few bit in northeastern Syria, but more so northwestern Syria this week, where you have the Russians and the pro-government forces continuing their push into Idlib, while at the same time you do have Turkey moving military assets into both northwestern and northeastern Syria. Turkey is conducting, of course, shellings in northeastern Syria yet again. You actually have a Russian airfield operating out of northeastern Syria, close to the Turkish border, which is apparently very close to an American base, a remaining American base of operations in northeastern Syria still left. So one could say, in relation to Turkey having this massive buildup on and in Syria, that the fact that you have pro-government and even Russian operations in northeastern Syria in the quote-unquote SDF-controlled Syria may show some signs of reconciliation between the SDF and the Assad government, which, in the absence of the American Empire, and we saw this in 2019, actually about almost 2 years ago at this point, I think just over 2 years ago, where you actually had SDF leadership seriously sitting down with the Syrian government representatives in 2018, 2019, upon the announcement of American withdrawal by Trump. Of course, you remember all the controversy, how Trump betrayed the Kurds or whatever. That in the time where they thought the Americans were seriously going to leave the country in full, they had entered into negotiations for some sort of cooperation with the Syrian government. Now, for all we know, those negotiations are going on behind the back door, but it seems like at the end of 2019, begin 2020, those more or less stalled out and were brought to a close by the U.S. not actually leaving, which is to nobody's surprise. But again, activity continues as Idlib continues to be more and more choked out by the pro-government, I would say, just full-on assault into Idlib. And like I said, you see Turkey moving
Right. It
resources in there, more so into northeastern Syria with the Kurdish-held territories. But they are, of course, still nervous about a Syrian, Russian, and pro-government in general incursion even further into Idlib at this point. Even though I would say they have mostly given up on this, but I mean, you see them reinforcing areas like Afrin, so it could be that, again, that very light green chunk of northwestern Syria, as I'm sure you can also see on the map, that they're trying to shore up there more than, again, like greater Idlib or Idlib proper.
Yeah, and Idlib itself has been having a kind of internal civil government have had a small population living in that part of Syria for quite some time. This is probably goes all the way back to like the Mongol hordes, and then the Turkmen after that period, with with the Seljuks invading and so on. But a lot of them are also Uyghurs. There's hundreds on to fight in Syria, um, along with hundreds and hundreds of having this war, and Al-Shishani has left. This was a small group that was almost always butting heads with HTS. So now, is this happening because they need to consult, like Assad's forces and the SDF? They need to consolidate their power together in order to stand up against Turkey, because HTS is going to have to get all these groups in line in order to stand up to Russian bombardment and um, Syrian shelling and tanks.
Oh, certainly. And again, like I said, while Turkey is building up for all these operations, as you're saying, you have this Russian bombardment. You had 7 airstrikes on headquarters of the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army, which is, of course, one of the many militant groups operating out of Idlib. And the hour before that, you had 4 strikes on militant positions in the southern countryside of Idlib. So you have Russia more or less hammering away because Turkey's main concern again is in that north eastern Syria pocket, but you do see them showing some concern with northwestern Syria. But it looks like any instability that Turkey is causing within these non-government held areas right now is being completely exploited by Russia in particular and by pro-government forces in general. And that's a trend I imagine you would see continue. At this point, again, I
Hmm.
think Erdogan has more or less accepted that Assad is going to be in Syria, that the Syrian government is going to be pro-Russia for the very foreseeable future, and that there's no sense in really trying to dislodge it or even keep a thorn in its side. But where butting heads will be, and you could even see how Iranian interests play into this, particularly in that chunk of northeastern Syria. How is that going to play out between Turkey, Russia, and Iran? It's funny, this harkens back to 2018, 2019, where you had the Putin, Rouhani, and Erdogan summits almost on a weekly basis, or at least every other week, trying to discuss the fate of particularly northeastern Syria, because that's an area where they're all, again, they all have this deep seated interest in. And even when you compare the Russians and the Iranian interest, I'm not saying that they're completely at odds, but they do conflict to a significant degree. I don't think it's enough to pull Russia and Iran apart from each other. I don't think it's enough to bring them into conflict with each other, or, freeze over relations. But that those are considerations to be made. And then, of course, you have the element of Turkey operating in northeastern Syria. So certainly something to keep your eye on. These Turkish operations have only just begun. They are simultaneous, and I imagine over the next couple weeks we will see those escalate to what their fullest potential is going to be. Now, what Erdogan's greater goal in mind is, I certainly wouldn't know. But like I said, I speculate in northwestern Syria it's a shoring up of, again, those more pro-Turkish groups, maybe such as the SNA, in northwestern Syria, and of course, just pushing further into northeastern Syria and more or less, I would say, demoralizing the Kurds on both sides of the border because, as far as I know, tensions with the Kurdish population of Turkey has been down, but again, just to show that we can exert our force over you. And again, that is also has to do with the refugee crisis, concerning the fact that despite what the map may show, just because the political organizations in charge of northeastern Syria are mostly Kurdish, the population is still 90% Syrian Arab. And you can see in that, again, occupation zone, that blue strip along the northeastern and Turkish border, one of the primary goals was the resettlement of Syrians back into Syria by Turkey because just trying to ease the burden on themselves having these millions of refugees in their country. And maybe this is another operation pertaining to that because it's become much less tenable to use these migrants as a weapon along the Turkish or Bulgarian borders. And maybe it's another resettlement operation, but I think time will tell. But I do think Turkey is really gearing up to dig into whatever interest it has left in Syria, and I doubt it is going to budge anytime soon. Now, how that will bring them into conflict, or maybe conflict's a bit of a strong word for that, but to odds with the Syrian government, Russia, and Iran, that remains to be seen.
Right. I mean, Erdogan's a stubborn guy, but he has an America that wants him out. He has a growing population that wants him out. He has a country that is still suffering from economic woes. There's a lot of pressure on him, and there's a diminishing return in him being able to wage war in Syria versus the Kurds, primarily the Kurds, but also the Syrians proper. In a way, what he needs is, like, he needs an offer. He needs a way to bow out gracefully, uh, with a lot of gains in the process for him to leave. What it is that can be offered to him, I don't know.
That's something that, you know, Russia and Iran would probably have to figure out because I think he is looking for that. I think he is actually because he hasn't made any more gains. Afrin, he's losing gradually more control. Idlib, he is not coming through. They still suffer, as I said, from these little internal civil wars. When they're facing both the Syrians and the Russians. So I think he needs a way to exit Syria, and he himself is looking for like a sweetheart deal for him to leave. Now it will bring the ire of the Turkmen. It will bring the ire of the Uyghurs, but that's okay. Then they're not exactly like some great political force. And even probably some of the Chechens that have been receiving protection there. But
I would
that's
say,
what I
much more
suspect.
concerned Erdogan, he would probably draw the ire of further right and more nationalistic elements in Turkey for having backed down in the face of foreign aggression. And I would agree with you that he's probably looking for a sweetheart deal. He's looking for something
Yeah,
he can tangibly take away and show the Turkish people this is
yeah,
what we got out of our intervention in Syria, and this is why it was worth it. And he's just, I think that's
yeah,
the main thing keeping Turkey and Syria right now. They need some sort of saving face in order to get them out. They need something that they can point to because again, it's not exactly like it. It's not America in 2003 where you can say we overthrew Saddam for democracy and a substantial part of the politically active population will be like, oh yeah, that was totally worth it. Like, the Turkish people and again just Middle Easterners in general, people from that part of the world in general, are going to want something a bit more than that, something a bit more than the abstract or ideological. They want something that you can point to and say, well, this is why it was worth it. And seeing as this gets pushed away, and again, I don't know if this is the plan. I know this is the plan previously, but I don't know how tenable this is now. Even if there could be a resettlement of however many refugees back into Syria due to this operation, that could be something he could point to. I mean, just anything I think he's looking for right now. But that's all I had on Syria, unless you had any
right.
additional
Because he's gotten
news.
it. No, I was just going to say, his population of 3 million is now at 4.5 million Syrian refugees since 2014, 15. So yeah, there you have it. Uh, I mean, there's many that want him out permanently. Um, so yes, that's all I had to say for Syria.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning into this somewhat long episode of the War Report.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for sticking around. We had a lot to cover, and we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.